Welcome to Stanford Legal, where we talk about the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Pam. Pam, today we're going to talk about immigration, and we've talked about immigration and deportation and the like before, but it's a continuing story with our president promising to deport millions less than a month ago, the wall being back on in terms of funding, tragic events near our border. So we're going to cover it again today.
Well, and we have two people with us who are going to be just wonderful guests for us because their range of knowledge and their experience is so extensive. The first one is our colleague Lucas Gutentag. He's a professor of the practice of law at Stanford. Before he came to Stanford, he spent 25 years at the ACLU as the founder and director of their Immigrants' Rights Project, which, if you've been following everything from the Muslim ban through the separation of families at the border and like, they are at the cutting edge there. And Lucas is their kind of founding father, the James Madison, if you will, or Alexander Hamilton, I guess would be better for our listeners, the Alexander Hamilton of immigrants' rights. He also spent a couple of years recently during the Obama administration at the Department of Homeland Security, where he was a special advisor to the Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson. And now he's back at Stanford, where he teaches a course on immigration law.
And we're also glad to have Julia Neusner. Julia's a law student here, and she's also getting a master's at the Freeman Spogli Institute in International Relations. Julia's worked with Lucas, and she recently formed something called the Stanford Asylum Project and led a group of Stanford law students to Tijuana to work with asylum speakers. Welcome, Julia and Lucas.
And I will say, for any of our listeners who want to learn a little bit more about Julia's work on the Stanford Asylum Program, there's a fantastic article in the Stanford Lawyer. It's stanfordlawyer.org, I believe, or Stanford Lawyer edu. But I went and put a tiny URL together so our listeners will be able to find it more easily. And it's tinyurl.com /Julia Border, one word, and you'll be able to read this story, which is both inspiring in the sense of what our students are doing and horrifying in the sense of what they've been dealing with and what people are experiencing at the border.
And I want to echo that, Pam. I was in tears at reading part of that story. It was so heartbreaking and affecting to me. You can hear it in my voice as I speak about it. Julia, will you take us there? You're going to the border with some Stanford students. What are you doing there, and what are you finding?
So we're working with a nonprofit called Al Otro Lado that does legal services for primarily asylum seekers. They also work with deportees in Tijuana. We took 3 separate trips this year, with a total of around 50 graduate students, mostly law students. And students were primarily doing Know Your Rights trainings and individual consultations with asylum seekers in Al Otro Lado's office. But then they also helped out with all sorts of other projects that the organization has going on, like they serve hot meals to migrants every day, help connect them with shelters and other social services. So our group really had their hands in all those different projects while they were there.
And maybe, Lucas and Julia, you can tell us a little, what does it mean to seek asylum? Who's entitled to asylum, and how do they go about getting it?
So the asylum laws of the United States and under international law entitle any person who's physically present in the United States, regardless of how they arrived, to apply for protection from return against the country where they fear persecution. A person has to demonstrate that they have what's called a well-founded fear of persecution in their home country, and if they make that claim, then they're entitled to an adjudication of whether or not they would in fact suffer persecution or risk persecution in their home country. And under the law, that's guaranteed to everyone. It's the international treaty that was adopted after World War II because of the horrors of the Holocaust. The United States became a party to it, and it's embedded in U.S. law.
And so when people apply for asylum, what do they do?
Well, it depends. whether they're arriving at the border or whether they're already in the country. And that's one of the disputed things that's going on now, is that the new policies are trying to prevent people from actually being able to assert their claim to asylum if they're arriving at the border or trying to arrive at the border. But what they're supposed to be able to do is make out the claim, demonstrate why they fear persecution, have an interview, have a fair process, and if they lose, have an appeal of the denial of their claim.
So, Julia, take us to what it's like at the border. You're in Tijuana. What's happening if you get there to apply for asylum? How quickly do you get heard? And what kind of claims of persecution do these asylum seekers have?
So, as Lucas explained, under the law and in the past, people have been able to show up to a port of entry and request asylum from any U.S. officer, and the officer was obligated to take the person into U.S. custody, bring them to a safe place, and for the duration of their the adjudication of their claim. What we're seeing now, and this began around 2015 and has gotten much more robust in recent years, is this unofficial metering system that the United States and Mexico are collaborating to implement across the border, where people are actually being turned away when they show up at the port of entry and ask for asylum, and they're being sent to an area near the border to put their names on a handwritten list that's actually overseen by asylum seekers themselves and Grupos Beta, which is the Mexicans' social services immigration enforcement agency. And people have to add their names to this handwritten list, which again isn't part of either country's official policy. And the wait time now is anywhere from 4 to 7 months. There's currently 10,000 people whose names are on the list in Tijuana just waiting to present themselves at the port of entry to ask for protection.
So is that a much bigger number? Are we seeing a lot more people seeking asylum today than 5 years ago or 3 years ago? Or is it just what's causing this is the refusal to let people into the country while their asylum claims are being heard?
There has been an increase in people entering the country illegally, which many attribute to these limitations on the ability to seek asylum. People just are unwilling to or can't wait in Mexico for the opportunity to ask for protection.
Yeah, the numbers at the border have increased significantly since the early 2000s, or the 2010s, I mean. There was the first uptick was in 2014 when there was a significant number of unaccompanied minors arriving at the border, and then what started happening in 2015, 2016, and now especially in 2017 is families coming, seeking protection, especially mothers and children, because of the conditions in what are called the Northern Triangle countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and especially the threat of gangs, persecution based on domestic violence claims, and other human rights abuses that are going on. So the number of people seeking asylum has gone up, and the response under the Trump administration has been to try to deter them, to deny them, to distort the law in order to make them ineligible for asylum, and all in response to what is a refugee flow that this country's experienced previously in other circumstances, and many other countries have experienced. And our obligation is to respond to it by addressing the refugee claims, not by punishing, deterring, or preventing people from coming to the United States in the first place.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking about immigration and the border and asylum with our colleague Lucas Gutentag and Julia Neusner.
So, Julia, I want to come back to what you witnessed there, because Lucas has told us that this is a refugee flow that comes every now and then when horrific events happen in other parts of the world. People are waiting 3, 4, 5 months in camps. What's it like in these camps?
So I visited a camp in December. Since around January, the organization I work with no longer allows volunteers to visit camps because of safety concerns. But the camp I visited in December was called El Baratal. It was holding close to 3,000 migrants. And it was really unpleasant. There were tents stacked up against each other on multiple levels of this concrete structure that used to be a nightclub. And I arrived with some people who were sharing space with the Legal Services Organization, who had collected clothing and shoe donations to distribute to people. And they were just inundated with people who desperately needed these things when we arrived at the shelter. And then another a student in the class of 2019, Hana Matsunaga, and I went in with our hats indicating that we would be able to provide asylum information. And we also had an immigration attorney with us, and we were just absolutely swarmed with people. People really don't have any information about what the process is like. People are confused about this metering system. Many of them travel really long, dangerous journeys by foot across Central America to come to the border, hoping that, thinking that they'll be able to get protection when they arrive, and then they find they have to wait in these camps. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of people without the basic resources they need for survival. That camp that I visited was actually closed by the government because organized crime established presences in the camps. Young women were disappearing. Human trafficking had become rampant. So it's really not safe there. And some of the stories I heard when I spoke to people were really harrowing of the things that they were escaping. As Lucas explained, the organized crime, especially in the Northern Triangle countries, has really become reached a critical point.
And the administration seems to be taking the position that they want to cut off a lot of the legal claims by saying that, for example, somebody who fears domestic violence can't seek asylum. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, we've seen multiple tactics by the administration. One is to try to reinterpret who the law protects by issuing legal rulings by the Attorney General that, for example, domestic violence as a general matter can't be a basis for asylum. That's flatly inconsistent with U.S. and international law. That persecution on the basis of gang membership can't be a basis for asylum. That's flatly inconsistent with U.S. and international law. So there's an attempt to distort the law in order to make people ineligible. And then there's also the effort to prevent people from even accessing the system. One, through the metering that Julia was describing of keeping people in Mexico so that they can't apply at all. Another new procedure that's been adopted is to take people who do manage to get into the United States and then to require them to return to Mexico while their claims are pending. So we have two different groups of people now, asylum and refugee applicants in Mexico. One is people who can't get access to the system, and two, those who have actually applied and have a case pending in the United States are being sent back to Mexico. That number now is estimated to be around 20,000. It may be higher. We don't know for sure. And so those people are waiting to have a claim heard in the United States. But of course, there's no meaningful way for lawyers to represent them, to find them, for people to know when to appear for their hearings. And that's only the beginning. Other rules have been established as well, all as a mechanism to try to prevent people from pursuing the claims that they're entitled to or being granted relief if they're able to overcome all those hurdles.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with Julia Neusner and Lucas Gutentag about asylum seekers on the border. Joe?
And Lucas, can you give us a sense of what is a legal community that is on the other side of the administration? Where is a fight being had as a legal matter?
Well, there's been litigation over almost every one of these policies.
Yeah.
Most, but not all of them, have been enjoined by various courts. They're working their way through the appeals now. One rule that was adopted was to prohibit anyone who doesn't enter through a port of entry. In other words, someone who enters between ports, is arrested by the Border Patrol, that those persons should be categorically barred from asylum eligibility. That's been enjoined by the courts, upheld on the Ninth Circuit. No action by the Supreme Court. Supreme Court upheld the injunction, as a preliminary matter. There's another provision that says anybody who's passed through Mexico should be prohibited from being eligible for asylum. That's been enjoined by the district courts. There's been the restriction on eligibility based on gang membership and domestic violence. There's been a ruling by a district court finding that that's inconsistent with the asylum laws. But as these rules still continue to be applied in many cases, depends on the scope of the injunction, depends on who's covered and so on. The return to Mexico policy was enjoined by the district court, and that's been stayed by the Ninth Circuit, so it's on appeal. So there's legal challenges to virtually every one of these policies, and for the most part, they've been found illegal, but there's no final resolution of those claims
And
yet.
meanwhile, if we allow, say, at the extreme, only 20, 30 people, 5, 10 people a day to actually get a hearing, we've effectively denied all of these claims in any event.
Right.
As a practical matter.
As a practical matter,
Yeah.
people are being forced to remain in Mexico or being sent back to Mexico while their claims are pending, to circumstances that are themselves, as Julia was saying, and she can, I think, probably expand on this, incredibly dangerous to the people because of the violence that's following the refugees when they come to Mexico, or who are then being preyed upon by criminal elements in Mexico.
And you were down there at the beginning of August. Can you tell us what you saw?
I just got back this morning. So Al Otro Lado, as I said earlier, was primarily working with people who, preparing them for their credible fear interview, which happens before you enter the country to request asylum. But now they've really had to shift their focus with the Remain in Mexico program that Lucas referenced, because they estimate that around 11,000 people have been sent back just to Tijuana under that program. So they have, on the one hand, 10,000 people who are waiting to request asylum, and then in addition to that, these 11,000 people who have gone in, been taken into custody by the U.S., given a notice to appear, and then sent out into Tijuana without any type of support or resources or legal support. So El Otro Lado has been running clinics to help this population. I helped with one of them this past weekend. They have volunteer attorneys who are coming down on the weekends to help fill out applications for asylum for the people that have been returned.
And you really need a lawyer to do this right. That is, how able is the average person with a meritorious asylum claim to be able to make out that claim if they don't have legal assistance?
Really difficult, and the applications are in English, and many of these people don't speak English. And it's really difficult without a lawyer. The few asylum claims by people who were put into this Remain in Mexico program that have been heard by an immigration judge have almost all of them have been rejected. So it's really difficult. And the humanitarian services in the city are really overwhelmed. The El Otro Lado lawyers have been telling me that more people have been sleeping in the streets, that they've been doing court observation in San Diego, and they see that people are visibly ill and appear to have been through a lot. And they have one family, one indigenous family, whose children were somebody tried to abduct their children while they were sleeping on the streets, and they're trying to convince a judge that Mexico is not safe for these people, but under the policy they keep on being sent back.
We'll be back with more from our guests Lucas Gutentag and Julia Neusner talking about immigration and deportation in the United States next on Stanford Legal here on Sirius XM Insight 121. Welcome back to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman. And just a reminder that we're talking about immigration today. And if you want to read more about the work that Julia has been doing at the border, check out tinyurl.com/Julia Border. That's one word. And you'll be able to read about the Stanford Asylum Project. Joe?
Well, we've been talking about the problems at the border. I want to change the focus a little bit to talk about the problems outside the border for individuals that are undocumented. Can you brief us on that?
Yes, I mean there are a large number of people. The estimates are in the neighborhood of 11 million who are undocumented, residing in the United States. And the first thing I think that's important to understand is that overwhelmingly, this is a population that have lived here for a long time, have deep roots in the United States, are contributing to the economy, oftentimes have U.S. citizen children who are born here. They're part of the community, but they're vulnerable to deportation. And one of the goals of the Trump administration has been either to deport them or to so scare them that they'll go completely underground or leave, and by intimidating them about the threat of deportation. Until this administration, there was a broad consensus that we needed to do something through the law and through executive action to the extent that it's possible to provide some degree of stability and ultimately some kind of legal status for this long-time undocumented population as part of our community.
And that includes the Dreamers as one of the kind
Absolutely.
of most obvious groups.
Right. One of the group that's gotten the most attention are the so-called Dreamers, those who came here as children and are eligible for temporary protection under the so-called DACA program, which the Trump administration has tried to terminate, that the courts have enjoined the termination, and that case is now before it will be heard by the Supreme Court in the fall on whether or not the end of the DACA protection program is permissible. But they're a small segment, that's roughly 800,000 people in that program of a much larger population that's undocumented.
You know, another part of the population that's affected are U.S.-born children of parents
Right.
that are threatened for deportation. And if you can imagine coming home and finding your parents gone, and that's something I know a lot of families are struggling with in this area.
Right. There's enormous fear of exactly that the parents will be vulnerable to deportation, and kids are sent to school with instructions about what to do if the parents are arrested or detained, what to do if the parents are deported. And so there's enormous fear in the community of people who are trying to live their lives, contribute to the society, and haven't engaged in any kind of, criminal conduct or anything else, but are simply here without legal status, but have lived here for a long period of time. And I think one of the other things that's important to understand is how our deportation system works. And it's a civil process, but it subjects people to detention, oftentimes for long periods of time, years of detention in some cases before people actually get a hearing before an immigration judge. And there's no right to a lawyer in a deportation proceeding. There's no right to appointed counsel, even though the consequences are so devastating. The lawyers are available only if someone can afford to pay for it or if there's pro bono counsel willing and able to provide representation. So the whole system is one that essentially denies due process, denies any kind of a fair procedure, and yet the consequences are so devastating that you would think it would provide the greatest level of protection, not the least.
And the current administration seems to be both ratcheting up the level of fear with these threats of mass raids but also trying to do deportation kind of on the quick, as opposed to going through a process in which people can get a lawyer, can say, I've been here for a long time, because the government has the discretion to allow you to stay. That is, they're not required to kick you out of the country if you don't have documentation.
Right, that's exactly right. There's discretion, there's prosecutorial discretion. This was the major initiative of the Obama administration to exercise that prosecutorial discretion to allow people to remain if they didn't pose a threat, a national security threat or a public safety threat. But the most recent announcement of the Trump administration is to expand a program called expedited removal, which is what's currently being applied at the border, to apply that throughout the country to anyone that any immigration officer says has been here for less than 2 years. So anybody who's arrested, if the immigration officer says you've been here for less than 2 years, would be subject to an expedited expulsion system where there's no right to a hearing at all, and the person would just be summarily removed. That hasn't gone into effect yet. It's been announced. It's just been challenged in court. It raises kind of the most core questions about how the due process clause applies to persons in the United States, but it would set up a summary expulsion process to anyone who's been here for less than 2 years.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with Julia Neusner and Lucas Gutentag about immigration and deportation. Joe?
Lucas, what do you do? Give our viewers and listeners a sense of your day to challenge these policies.
I'm sorry?
Give us a sense of what you do at the law school to challenge policies like that.
Well, one is I try to explain them to people so they understand and what the Constitution means and what it ought to mean. Secondly, I continue to work on some of the litigation that's challenging some of these cases, and some of the students work on those as well. And we have students who represent individuals
in deportation proceedings and in asylum proceedings as part of the Immigrants' Rights Clinic.
Right. Yeah, we have students very actively involved both through the clinic and then through various organizations, some that I work with and others as well, working on these various challenges. There's also a separate project that I've taken on with law students, which is to track every administrative policy change of this administration. There's a website that we're about to launch so that individuals can see, advocates can see every policy change that's been made, because all of what the Trump administration has done has been through rules, regulations, executive actions, memos, directives, internal instructions, and so on that can be undone by a new administration. And I think we need to plan for the day when that time comes, when all of these policies can be undone. And so the goal of this project is to comprehensively track them so they don't get lost in the shuffle and a new administration can promptly undo the worst damage that the Trump administration's done.
I mean, this expedited removal sounds like they're just going to grab somebody on the street and fly them down to Mexico and push them over the border.
I
had a client like that who went to a government office to deal with something, and they just took her and they walked her across the bridge into Mexico that afternoon, and it took her 3 months to get back into the United States. And she had what was called a U visa. She was legally entitled to be here because she'd cooperated with the government on a criminal investigation.
Right. I mean, that's another one of the big problems is people who are U.S. citizens get removed by ICE on a not infrequent basis because deciding who's a U.S. citizen, A, a person may not know, and B, even a person born outside the United States, it can be a United States citizen. So oftentimes individuals are deported, and then only years later does it turn out that they were actually a United States citizen. So all of those things go on. That's why there needs to be a meaningful process with a lawyer where a person can contest whether or not they are in fact deportable or not, whether or not they are in fact entitled to asylum, whether they're entitled to other forms of protection like the U visas or others.
And my guess is that the immigration bar, particularly those who have any space for pro bono work, are just inundated. Yes. So this is like a tidal wave on a relatively small part of the legal profession.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, there's a huge need for pro bono lawyers, and there are organizations in every city in the country that are organizing and seeking pro bono lawyers. There's the American Immigration Lawyers Association, which is the professional association of immigration lawyers that has an effort to organize pro bono lawyers. There's lawyers' committees for civil rights in various locations and so on, all in the effort of finding more lawyers to provide legal representation.
And even those people who aren't lawyers can make a difference by letting their members of Congress know about this. There was a really moving story in the New York Times last week about a community that surrounded a family in their van to make it clear that the immigration authorities were trying to violate the law by telling these people they had to come out of their van, which they didn't have to do. I mean, so there's a lot that everybody can do.
Right. And there's a lot of efforts to educate, and law students are very engaged. There's a lot of effort to educate the community on legal rights, the Know Your Rights efforts for exactly that ICE doesn't have the right to enter a home. ICE warrants are not the same as a judicial warrant. They don't entitle entry. There's lots and lots of important legal rights that people can assert.
Well, we've been talking with Julia Neusner and Lucas Gudentag about really the crisis at our border and the crisis outside of our border. And I guess the general theme here is how much do we value due process for people who aren't U.S. citizens? And I guess the answer is perhaps not as much as we might.
Not enough.
Not enough. So thank you for joining us, Lucas and Julia, and thanks to our listeners for listening to us. This is Stanford Legal on Sirius XM Insight 121.